Today, we're going to be talking to Kevin Donovan. He's the chief investigative reporter at the Toronto Star. He's written a book called Billionaire Murders, The Mysterious Deaths of Barry and Honey Sherman. He's got a podcast, and there's a documentary, if you haven't seen it, titled Billionaire Murders on Crave. And recently, he's just written an article lately in the Toronto Star about what police didn't ask. You can grab your copy of the Star or go online to read the article. Kevin, are you there?
Thanks for having me on this morning.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having us. Can you give us, for anyone who's not familiar with this case, can you just give us the Coles Notes version of what transpired a few years ago?
Yes, and in fact, 7 years ago, shockingly to me, Barry Sherman was the founder of Apotex, a generic drug giant in Canada, and his wife, Honey Sherman. They're both billionaires and philanthropists. On December 13th, 2017, they were both murdered between about 8 and 9:30 p.m. in their house, and their bodies were staged or posed beside their basement swimming pool in a seated position, belts looped around their neck and tied to a low railing above them. They weren't found for 36 hours. There was nobody scheduled to be in their house. Family members, nobody seemed to be really checking on them. Barry was 75 years old, but running Apotex, somebody who's interested in the minutia of his job, and still nobody's checking on this guy who's this titan of industry. And they're found 36 hours after they're murdered, and the police initially dismissed this as a murder-suicide. I got involved 3 weeks after the bodies were found. My boss had asked me to look into, see if it was murder-suicide or a double murder, and actually gave me the other assignment, if it was double murder, find out who did it. And so I was able to, through my sources, do a story, I would say 5 weeks after the bodies were found, saying that forensics showed actually that it was a double murder. Police then made a public statement saying that basically that in fact it was a double murder and what the Star reported was correct. And the problem with this, there's been a lot of problems with the case, but they spent so much time asking the wrong question, like why would Barry murder Honey and then take his own life, and not asking the correct question, who would have done this?
Absolutely. Are there any other questions you feel that the police didn't ask when they were doing their murder investigation?
Yeah, and it was the subject of a story I did recently. I went back over a lot of information that I've unearthed from court documents. It's a lengthy procedure I've been involved in to get the police files unsealed so I can properly scrutinize it. And what I've learned is that the police were not asking people, family, friends, business associates, where were you on the night of the murders or the week of the murders? They just didn't ask for alibi information. And not suggesting that any of them were involved, but that's kind of homicide 101. Mm-hmm. You want to find out where people were, make a record of that, and then afterwards, if you find out that they were not telling the truth, then that might give you a lead of some sort, or like a lead to the suspect. So that's another question that wasn't asked. So many mistakes were made, poor video collection, poor forensic collection at the scene. It was a real mess. And my sort of obsessive interest in this is because if this can happen in a case with such high-profile people, then what happens in all the other homicide cases? So that's why I'm trying to shed light on all this.
Interesting. No, I mean, I think that there are lots of Torontonians who really appreciate your hard work in shedding light, because I think we're all sort of fascinated, like, who in the world would want to kill this couple? How did it happen, and why did it happen? And that's something that we're all trying to figure out. And it is disturbing. I mean, maybe it's because I've spent too much time watching things like Law and Order that I see, but a murder can get solved in 30 minutes. I don't understand.
Yeah, and of course, the homicide detectives say, well, it's not like on TV, but Law and Order is a good example. You have the opening scene, the two detectives show up and they find the body. There's usually, because of television, a quip of some sort, and then they go to commercial break, and then the next beat is usually asking people where you were at the time of the murder. And so on the first issue, one of the initial mistakes in this case is that the senior homicide detective who was assigned to the Sherman investigation that day didn't go to the crime scene. She didn't go when the bodies were there. She didn't go for 4 days. Oh. And that's just, no, I mean, there's a reason why Law and Order, it's not fiction that detectives go to the crime scene, right? That fiction is drawn from fact in that case. And then the other issue about, asking for alibis is just basic information. And it's unfortunate, and I find it concerning.
And so why did that detective wait 4 days before checking out the crime scene?
Well, when I found that out a few years ago, I went to the police, and these days the police are shielded by their public relations people, and they said she was confident with the junior detective that went to the scene, and that was all that was necessary. It just doesn't make sense to me. As I've reported, the detective, Susan Gomes, had kind of one foot out of the door of the homicide department. She put in her time, and on a holiday season, maybe something else was going on, but there's no. I gave the police the opportunity to say that Detective Sergeant Gomes, the senior officer who should have gone to the scene, had something else to do, because of course there's other murders in the city, but that's not information they provided to me. So I'm assuming she just decided not to go.
Wow, geez. Now, I remember reading reports earlier that the family had hired a private investigator, and this was partly because when the police officers deemed it to be a murder-suicide and everybody felt that was just, there's no way that was true, the family did hire a private investigator. Do they still have that private investigator working on the case?
Yeah, so they don't. What happened was the bodies are discovered on a Friday. There's statements made by the junior detective at the crime scene on TV and in the press that they're not looking for outstanding suspects. And so the Sherman family, some of the children anyways, decided that they should, in fact, somebody had called them up and said, you might want to hire a private investigator. So what they did is they hired Brian Greenspan, who was a quite famous Toronto criminal lawyer. And Mr. Greenspan then hired a bunch of ex-homicide cops that he'd worked with before and asked them to investigate. Their role ended about 2 years after that. The daughter, the Shermans had 4 children, daughter Alexandra decided that she didn't like the private investigators were taking in information and perhaps not giving it all to the police. And so she argued with her brother, Jonathan, who was kind of pulling the strings on the private investigator work, and eventually Mr. Greenspan and the homicide detectives handed everything over. So no, there's not any private investigation like that going on. Jonathan Sherman, the son, did then hire his own lawyer, who then hired a retired homicide detective to do his own investigation, but as far as I can tell, nothing came of that.